Good afternoon. I'm Carol Bauman, Director of the Institute of World Affairs, Division of University Outreach at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. On behalf of all three sponsors of this program, the university, the City of Milwaukee, and the Pabst Theater, I'd like to introduce this first George F. Kennan Forum on International Affairs. The sponsors of the forum regard it as an annual public event designed to focus major current issues, discuss current major issues in the arena of foreign affairs. This year, in recognition of the dramatic and fundamental developments in the Soviet Union and in Eastern Europe, we decided to focus the forum on East-West relations in the new era of détente. Obviously, the combination of that topic, along with our roster of distinguished speakers, was a winning one, as attested to by this sold-out audience of about 1,400 in attendance. Included in that number are over 190 college students and over 200 high school students and teachers. It is they, after all, who are the future leaders of this country, and what better role model for them than to see and hear a George Kennan. Their attendance was made possible by the generous contributions of several community supporters who are listed at the back of your programs. I want to thank not only them, but also our co-sponsors, the mayor personally and his staff, and the director of the Pabst Theater and his staff, for helping to bring to fruition in this forum a concept that was just another good idea a short 6 months ago. Since we've had to turn away a significant number of people who wished to attend, I do want to point out that the entire program is being videotaped for later broadcast over C-SPAN, the National Public Affairs cable system, and over Channel 26, the government channel of the City of Milwaukee. It is also being audio taped for radio broadcast in segments over WUWM-FM, the university's own radio station. I would now like to introduce to you the Chancellor of the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, Dr. Clifford V. Smith, Jr., who will give the official welcome. Dr. Smith.
Good morning and welcome. UWM is delighted, quite delighted, to join with the City of Milwaukee in honoring Ambassador Kennan. First of all, because he is a distinguished native son whose lifetime achievements as a scholar and a diplomat are extraordinary. At our commencement ceremonies tomorrow, the university will have the honor of awarding Ambassador Kennan an honorary Doctor of Humane Letters degree in recognition of his singular contributions to the academic world and to the diplomatic world. We're also proud to be a part of this forum because our mission as a university is to prepare our students for the world of today and tomorrow, a world which clearly continues to become more and more international in scope. In addition to faculty and student exchange programs with a number of countries, we have established collaborative relationships with universities in China, Egypt, France, Germany, Great Britain, Hungary, Israel, just to name a few. And our campus is enriched and enlivened by the presence of international students and faculty members who represent cultural populations from all over the globe. Just a word about the Institute of World Affairs, headed by Dr. Bauman. As most of you know, it sponsors an ongoing series of lectures, conferences, diplomatic dinners, and study tours, which are designed to enrich our understanding of global events, other nations, other cultures, and including its co-sponsorship of several of the renowned Wingspread conferences. As members of an increasingly global human family, we can benefit immeasurably from a greater understanding and appreciation of cultures other than our own. And so, as Milwaukee's public university, it is very appropriate then that we join with the city in creating the Kennan Forum. I think it is a lasting and meaningful tribute to this remarkable man who has contributed in such a major way to our understanding of international events. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chancellor Smith. It is now my distinct pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Mr. William Hyland. A brief biographical sketch is printed in your program, so I'll only mention a few highlights of his illustrious public service and academic career. Mr. Hyland has served with the CIA, the National Security Council, and the Bureau of Intelligence and Research in the U.S. Department of State. He has also worked in the Georgetown Center for Strategic and International Studies in the office of Henry Kissinger. Particularly apropos of this forum, however, Mr. Hyland is the author of The Cold War is Over, just published this week, and he currently serves as the editor of Foreign Affairs, the prestigious academic journal in which Mr. Kennan first published his Mr. X article in 1947. We're particularly proud of that touch, Bill, to have you here. Mr. Hyland will address the topic, the U.S.-Soviet relationship, an overview. Mr. Hyland.
Chancellor Smith and Professor Bauman, it is a great pleasure for me to be here, especially because this is a forum honoring George Kennan. As Professor Bauman pointed out, there are few magazines that owe more to a single author than Foreign Affairs owes to George Kennan. I think it must be the most reproduced, reprinted article in scholarly literature, and we took the occasion last year to reproduce it once again, and once again it was one of our best sellers. So I am indebted to George Kennan for a number of reasons. However, appearing at the beginning of a program to talk about Soviet-American relations with George Kennan in the audience and with the Soviet ambassador also here reminds me of a story about the man who spent most of his life telling his friends about the Johnstown flood and bored everyone silly, and finally he passed on to the great beyond, and St. Peter said, you have one privilege when you enter here. You can address the choir of angels. And he said, oh, that's terrific. He said, I want to talk about the Johnstown flood. And St. Peter said, well, all right, but just remember, in the audience is Noah. So, nevertheless, I'm going to talk about Soviet-American relations, and not surprisingly, my opening remark is that the Cold War is indeed over. It's a title that I selected for my book because I happen to believe it. A few months ago, my editor suggested we put a question mark after the title, but I thought it was a little late in the game to change the cover. I think what is happening now, and it's important to understand this, is that President Bush and President Gorbachev are in fact negotiating a peace treaty, or at least the terms of a peace settlement of the Cold War. This process was actually begun by President Reagan and Mr. Gorbachev in their summit meetings, and especially in their agreement on limiting medium-range missiles from Europe. This is a very important period for all of us, and especially for you in this audience. I think it is perhaps the most important period in our history since the end of World War II. You will recall that at the end of World War I in 1919 and again in 1944-45, we had an opportunity to try and settle world affairs in a way that would preserve the peace, and in fact, we failed. We failed at Versailles in 1919, and we failed at the Yalta and Potsdam conferences in 1945. And then so the question really is, will the successors to Stalin and Roosevelt and Churchill and so forth, will they succeed? Can Bush and Gorbachev truly end the Cold War and establish a lasting peace? Those are certainly the questions that are confronting them even now Mr. Gorbachev prepares to come to Washington at the end of this month. I think we probably have the best chance to do so, to succeed, for one major reason, and that is that the issues that divided us so deeply from the Soviet Union over the past 45 to 50 years have begun to recede. Some of them have been resolved and some of them remain. But the ideological war, which was the cause of so much suspicion and bitterness, I believe is now over. And we can see that in the changes that Gorbachev is beginning to implement inside the Soviet Union, as well as in his foreign policy. The economic competition, which was one aspect that was very important in the earlier days when many people thought the Soviet Union would overtake us somehow, I believe that is over, and clearly the United States has prevailed in that particular contest. And the third aspect, the geopolitical conflict, largely over Europe and Eastern and Central Europe, seems to be over. It now seems, I think, almost certain that Germany will be united, and in that sense, a very important part of the Cold War is certainly behind us. But what remains? What do we confront now? First of all, we confront, I think, the relationship of the Soviet Union to Europe. Soviet Union is in a time of troubles, and Russia has in its history been in a time of troubles before, and has revived. And I think we must assume that over the decades, the Soviet Union, whatever it's called, Russia, the Soviet Union, will also revive. And when it does, the relationship between this very powerful country and the rest of Europe will be very important. And it's that relationship, I think, that we're trying to settle now in the negotiations between President Bush and Mr. Gorbachev. The second issue, which is not resolved and is still on the table, and that is the military relationship between the Soviet Union and the United States. There are arms control negotiations, several of them still underway in Geneva and in Vienna. As yet, they have not succeeded, but if they succeed, or if both countries agree informally in place of a regular treaty, there will be a new military relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union. That will be quite different. We already see it already in the press, the debate over the peace dividend, the debate over what is the threat, who is the enemy. It's fairly clear that the old days of confrontation are now behind us. What lies ahead, however, is not nearly as certain. The Soviet Empire, the empire created by Stalin, disappeared last year in Eastern Europe. The Russian Empire, the empire created over the last 400 years, remains, but it's beginning to break up. This is the meaning, I think, of what's happening in the Baltic, to some extent in Georgia, Moldavia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, and so forth. This multinational empire that was held together by the czars and by the communists is now coming apart. What it will lead to, no one, I believe, knows, but I think the important thing for you to bear in mind is that there is a difference here. The struggle over Germany and Eastern Europe was part of the Cold War, and it was very dangerous. The struggle over the breakup of the Soviet Union as a union is quite different in character, and it poses a different challenge for us. And of those of you who came in this theater and saw the small demonstration of Baltic countries will recognize, I think, that what is involved here is much more complicated than simply the Russians getting out of Czechoslovakia or Germany. Let me now turn to the past and to review some of the ups and downs of the Cold War. I was told before coming here that it would be a good idea to review the ups and downs, and I can't think of too many ups, at least not until recently. It seems to have been a series of downs followed by further downers. There are, I think, three questions I'd like to address this afternoon. First, why did the Cold War start? What was it all about? Second, how was it conducted? And third, how and why is it, in fact, over, if it is over? I think we have to go back 50 years to the Hitler-Stalin Pact. In my view, that was the beginning of the Cold War for various reasons. First of all, the territorial issues arose at that time with the disappearance of Poland, the incorporation in 1940 of the three Baltic countries into the Soviet Union, as well as Bessarabia, which is now called the Moldavian Socialist Republic, the war between the Soviet Union and Finland, which resulted in a change of borders, and most important of all, in the bargain that was struck between Hitler and Stalin, Hitler gained a free hand to pursue his war in the West against France and Great Britain with a secure Eastern Front. This, I think, was the fatal error of Stalin's. Soviet leaders still defend him and the pact with Hitler on the grounds that he had no choice. And perhaps they're right, but in any case, what Stalin thought would happen was that the capitalist powers, Germany, France, Britain, would exhaust themselves while he remained neutral on the sidelines. And in 1940, in the late spring of 1940, when Germany defeated France, all of his calculations suddenly were quite questionable. He had thought that the war would go on in the West for a long time, and now suddenly he was face to face with a very successful German military machine. And in that period in 1940, he was offered a rather intriguing deal by Stalin, who offered it, in fact, to Molotov in Berlin to carve up the world in spheres of influence, and the Soviet sphere would be the Persian Gulf and on toward the Indian Ocean. And Stalin, after thinking about it, accepted, but he accepted too late because Hitler had decided to attack Russia, and in fact, June 1941, of course, he did so. But even then, when the war had begun, Stalin's aims were quite ambitious. In December 1941, when German tanks were within sight of the Kremlin, and all of the world thought that the Soviet Union was on the brink of defeat, the government had been evacuated to Kuibyshev, Stalin met with the British Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden in December 1941, shortly after Pearl Harbor. And Stalin laid out his demands, and those demands were the quite familiar ones, the ones he had presented to Hitler. What he wanted his new allies to do was to guarantee the possessions he had obtained during the Hitler-Stalin period of the three Baltic republics, Eastern Poland or Western Ukraine, Bessarabia, and to give him a say in a number of other areas. And Roosevelt resisted, and Secretary Hull especially, and Sumner Welles, who was Undersecretary of State, said no. And the British, who were a little bit concerned that Stalin might make a separate peace treaty, even the British decided to resist that. And that's where, in my view, the Cold War began. When it was evident to Stalin that he was not going to get what he wanted, in fact, he said, this war is about our Western boundaries. When that became evident to him, there was a conflict that was never completely resolved. And as the war progressed, it became evident to Churchill and later to Roosevelt that there was almost no way of stopping Stalin in Eastern Europe because his army was victorious and they were occupying the major capitals of that area. So the war, in effect, the Cold War, had begun. It's possible that there might have been a settlement had we been cold-blooded enough. We might have carved up Europe, but the central problem that could not be settled then and has not been settled, in fact, for the last 45 years, was the problem of Germany. Stalin once said to Churchill, what is your worst nightmare? And Churchill said, what is yours? And he said, the revival of Germany. He said, that's what worries me. And in fact, he told the Yugoslav communists at this time, after 20 years, Germany will revive and will have another go at it. So Stalin's mood was such that there was no real chance, I think, for diplomats to settle the Cold War in 1945, whether at Yalta or Potsdam or before. And the myth grew up, I think, that Roosevelt, in effect, sold out Eastern Europe, and that myth of Yalta has haunted us ever since and has been part of the Cold War and has been one factor why American presidents have been very reluctant to meet with the Soviet leaders, and especially to strike any kind of an agreement, because there's this ghost of Yalta that is always raised at a time when our relations improve, and a suspicion that somehow the Russians have tricked us and that we're about to lose everything we have been struggling for. A turning point came in 1953 when Joseph Stalin died, and into office came a group of people not terribly well known to the West, but followers of Stalin. There was Georgy Malenkov, who became the prime minister, and Nikita Khrushchev, of course. At the time, it was not clear who was in command, and there was a great deal of speculation about a new course, that Malenkov was going to favor consumer goods and cut the Soviet military and implement a program of reforms. And there was a lot of interest in the Soviet Union at that particular time, but that was really an interlude. It led to the rise of Nikita Khrushchev and a totally different phase of the Cold War during the period of Khrushchev from 54 roughly till 1964, for a decade, which bridged the Eisenhower and Kennedy presidencies. Now, Khrushchev saw the world quite differently than Stalin. Stalin was really a rather cautious politician despite his brutality. He did not move rashly except in Korea, which is still something of a puzzle as to why he supported the war in Korea, because it led to the reanimation of the Western coalition, to the rearmament of Germany eventually, and to an alliance with Japan. So that still, it seems to me, is an aberration that's not fully clear. But in any case, Stalin had pressed matters to the point that some retrenchment had been called for, and that's what happened immediately after he died. And Winston Churchill thought perhaps there was a chance to settle the Cold War, and he proposed a summit meeting with the new Soviet leaders, but he was resisted by John Foster Dulles, who was our Secretary of State, and to some degree by President Eisenhower. They argued that the West was too weak to negotiate with the Soviet Union. Well, in retrospect, it's rather amazing how often we thought we were too weak to go to the bargaining table, when in fact we were much stronger than the Soviet Union at any point after the end of the war. Even in the 1950s, when it seems that the Soviet Union might overtake us somehow, we were basically much stronger. But Nikita Khrushchev, in effect, read his own propaganda and began to believe it. He thought that the Soviet Union was in the ascendancy everywhere in the world, that the world balance of power had changed because the former colonial areas were turning against their Western masters. And so you had revolts in Indochina and in Algeria, and you had the formation of a neutral bloc led by India, including Nasser and Tito. And Khrushchev believed that the opportunity had come to change once and for all the world balance of power in his favor. And so he decided to put on the pressure and to press the Western powers, and he chose the most vulnerable spot because it was the most exposed in Berlin. And the Berlin crisis, the second Berlin crisis, began in the late 1950s, when Khrushchev demanded that we leave Berlin altogether or make it a free city. Naturally, Eisenhower and then Kennedy resisted this. They understood that Berlin's function was to be the future capital of Germany. And as long as there was a Western foothold in Berlin, that meant that we were still committed to German unification somewhere along the line, even if some years hence, and that the German people could have some confidence in us that we would try to work for this eventuality. Khrushchev understood this as well, and that's why he wanted us out of Berlin. And when that didn't work, when he caused, in fact, a panic and an exodus of East Germans, he put up the wall after meeting Kennedy in Vienna. He put up the wall in August 1961, which accelerated the crisis because Kennedy's reaction was very tough, semi-mobilization in the United States, but Khrushchev was not getting what he wanted, which was a full-scale retreat. And this was a very dangerous period, as many who were involved will remember, and as my recollection, Ambassador Kennan had come back at this moment to serve as ambassador to Yugoslavia, ambassador of the United States to Yugoslavia. In any case, what Khrushchev did is well known, and that is he put missiles, Soviet missiles, into Cuba, and started the most dangerous crisis of the whole Cold War, the Cuban Missile Crisis, in October 1962. That, in my view, was Kennedy's finest hour. His conduct of that crisis can be faulted on tactics, but in general, he handled it extremely well and very courageously, I think. And we prevailed in that crisis, and it led, within 2 years, to the downfall of Khrushchev. And in that sense, it was another turning point in the Cold War. What that crisis was about was basically about the strategic balance in the world. There was a lot of dispute over it, and the historians are still arguing. But had Khrushchev succeeded, the world would have been quite different. For us to live under the threat of 60, 100, 150 Soviet missiles only a few hundred miles from the United States would have created a different psychological atmosphere. I think a case can even be made that there would have been a war between the United States and the Soviet Union had those missiles remained. But that's simply my judgment. In any case, Khrushchev was defeated. And in the process, however, Khrushchev had begun to sow the seeds of weakness in the Soviet system in ways that he did not anticipate and probably did not desire, but nevertheless were very important. In 1956, he attacked the memory of Joseph Stalin in a very famous secret speech, and in effect said Stalin had been a great criminal and that his era had been one of criminality. That notion of that the Soviet system itself was illegitimate began to spread, and it spread into Eastern Europe, and it spread to Hungary. And you'll remember that in 1956, there was a rebellion in Hungary, and it was put down by Soviet tanks. But that notion of Stalin's role in the international communist movement began to be a source of further dispute between China and the Soviet Union, reaching a point that in the early 60s, before Khrushchev was turned out, there was bitter battles between the Chinese and the Russians, and one of the most bitter fighters on the Chinese side was Deng Xiaoping, who was then one of Mao's chief lieutenants, and carried the polemic against Khrushchev face-to-face in meetings in Eastern Europe and in the Soviet Union itself. So already there was a secondary trend setting in. The Cold War was continuing. The confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union was still there, and in some ways, perhaps worse. But inside the Soviet Union, there was at work, and inside the communist movement, there were the seeds of decay and disintegration being planted. Now we turn to the Brezhnev era. Brezhnev came into office in 1964 and remained until 1982. And in many ways, it should be one of the most distinguished eras in Soviet history. But in fact, it is now regarded by the current Soviet leaders, they call it the era of stagnation. They didn't always call it that because it was not always the case. In the early period, in the mid-60s, there was again talk of reform inside the Soviet Union, and there were actual reform plans for the Soviet economy sponsored by the Prime Minister, Alexei Kosygin. Many of the ideas of Kosygin can be traced into the Gorbachev period. Decentralization, material incentives, price reforms, liberalization. But he didn't prevail. He didn't prevail because, in fact, what succeeded Khrushchev was a very conservative leadership under Brezhnev. Brezhnev was not a Stalinist in the sense of instituting a terrorist campaign, but he was a Stalinist in the sense that he believed the system was working and should be left alone. And that's the political system as well as the command economy. So nothing much happened after around 1968 internally. And that's when, or somewhat later, the era of stagnation began. But what was happening outside of the Soviet Union was equally important. The ideas of Kosygin, the idea that there could be reform and change, again seeped into Eastern Europe, where it was picked up by reformers, and especially picked up by Czechoslovak reformers inside the Communist Party, and mainly led by Alexander Dubček. And that reform reached a point where it alarmed the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union tried to stop it, but not successful, and then had to intervene once again with Soviet tanks in August 1968 on the eve of a summit conference that had been planned by Lyndon Johnson for the following fall. And that summit conference was called off the next day after the invasion, and things went into another one of the down periods of Soviet-American relations. It seemed as if the Cold War was virtually hopeless. Brezhnev proclaimed the doctrine, which carries his name. In effect, he said, we, the Soviet Union, have the right to intervene to protect the gains of socialism wherever they have been established. And that meant Eastern Europe, of course, but it also meant, perhaps, China. And that's where the impact of the Czech crisis was the greatest. It was not as great in Western Europe as it should have been, perhaps, but in China, they read the Brezhnev doctrine as a severe warning. If, in fact, Brezhnev meant that socialism in China could not be jeopardized by reformists or revisionists, as he called them, then there was a chance that the Soviet Union was, in fact, preparing to intervene in China with military force. And this, I think, was a very important turning point. It persuaded the Chinese that they had to do something to protect themselves against the Russians. And in classical formula, they called in the other power that could do so, and that was the United States. And I believe the opening to China created by Nixon, in fact, dates to the Czech invasion. In any case, that was another very important turning point as China broke totally with the Soviet Union and turned towards the United States. And second result of the Czech crisis, and equally important, was the change in the policies of West Germany. In the elections of 1969, in the wake of that crisis, for the first time since the 1920s, the West German Social Democrats came back to power. The chancellor was Willy Brandt, who had been the mayor of Berlin. And he had drawn some conclusions over the years about what Germany had to do in the world to protect its interests. And basically, his conclusion was you cannot rely on the Western powers, the United States, France, and England, to protect German interests, that Germany would have to take the lead in a new policy, which he called Ostpolitik, or Eastern policy. And you may recall that he went to the Soviet Union, he went to Poland, and he even went to East Germany, which at that time seemed a very radical move, in order to protect the possibility of German unification through what he called détente. And that détente was in fact spreading to the two superpowers. It was not, I think, the original notion of Richard Nixon when he came into office that he would end up before the first term signing arms control agreements with the Soviet Union. But he did have in the back of his mind, I believe, that there had to be a change in the relationship with China and in the relationship with the Soviet Union, if only because of the Vietnam War. Nixon's view was the Vietnam War had to be ended, but it had to be ended in some honorable way other than a simple withdrawal and retreat. And that meant dealing with the two powers on the communist side who might have some influence in the terms for ending the Vietnam War, Peking and Moscow. And that led, over a period of time, to the Nixon visit to China, which I think galvanized Brezhnev into what was called détente. Soon thereafter, we had the first arms control agreement on strategic weapons and the first visit of a president of the United States to the Soviet Union and the first of several summit conferences in May 1972. And therefore, we had come again to a turning point, but for the first time, it seemed like it might be turning up. There was a lot of optimism, perhaps more than justified, I think, in retrospect, in the press and the media, that at long last the Cold War was coming to an end and we had turned a corner. In fact, we had not, and for various reasons. One of the reasons it became apparent after the Nixon summits, there was still a lot of resistance in the United States to the notion of a détente with the Soviet Union. There are deep suspicions about the Soviet Union as late as 73, 74. One reason was the Middle East War, where the Soviet Union seemed to have encouraged the war and even threatened the United States in the middle of it with an intervention. Whether this was true or not, I'm not sure, but it added to the feeling that we really haven't made any progress with the Soviet Union, that this is not the end of the Cold War, and perhaps not even a genuine détente. And as a result, politics raised its head, and in the Congress, new restrictions on trade with the Soviet Union were linked to free immigration of Soviet Jews to the outside world, and that led to the collapse of negotiations about economic relations. And then we had Watergate, and in my view, Watergate contributed decisively to the end of détente with the Soviet Union, because it so weakened the presidency that it was almost impossible to conduct a foreign policy from the White House, whether it was Nixon or Ford or to some extent Carter. The executive had been weakened and discredited, and there was a great deal of suspicion that perhaps the Soviet Union was out to take advantage of it. And on the Soviet side, it also appeared that détente was not working. Brezhnev had entered détente basically, in my view, to stop the rapprochement between the Chinese and the United States, especially while Mao was still alive. And he proposed to Nixon and to Ford an alliance against the Chinese. He proposed it privately, but it's become subsequent public knowledge that we join in an alliance against the Chinese. And to their credit, of course, Nixon and Ford and Carter turned it down, and turned it down flat. So in the late 70s, suddenly appeared to Brezhnev that he wasn't going to get any trade benefits, he wasn't going to get any movement away from China, and the arms control negotiations didn't seem to be going particularly well, or at least not in his favor. And inside the Soviet Union, tensions were beginning to grow again as Brezhnev aged, and people began to think, who will replace Brezhnev and what will it mean? Brezhnev broke out of all of this, and it's not clear to me even now to what degree Brezhnev personally was involved, but he broke out of this problem by invading Afghanistan. And that sent a real chill and alarm through the West. One of the nightmares at the end of World War II had been that the Russians would advance to the Persian Gulf, dominating the supplies of oil and the entire geopolitical area. There was a confrontation in 1946 between Truman and Stalin, and the Russians had withdrawn and had remained behind the border. Now suddenly they were in Afghanistan, where the British had tried to block them for some 200 years, and it looked as if they were going to drive all the way to the Persian Gulf, and in fact that the Cold War was entering one of its most dangerous periods. That was not the case. One reason it was not the case is because people had not understood how basically Brezhnev had weakened the Soviet Union. And when he died in 1982 and was succeeded first by Andropov and then 3 years later by Gorbachev, the new leaders began to take a much harder look at the situation that confronted the Soviet Union, and to face up to the fact that Brezhnev's 20 years had led to a true economic crisis that could not simply be planned away or talked away by Pravda. The Soviet Union was on the brink of a genuine economic disaster. And when the new leaders realized this, and it took them, I think, a little while, one of the questions to Gorbachev, I think, is why did he not understand it, since he had been in the leadership since 1978? Why in 1985 did he not understand the true dimensions of the crisis he was facing? It's not clear to me. He was asked this question in my presence once in Moscow, and he said, if I told you, you wouldn't believe it. So it must have been quite a leadership there at the end. In any case, what's important, I believe, is that Gorbachev proceeded to conduct a revolution in Soviet policy. He not only conducted a revolution in domestic policy with the program of perestroika, and especially glasnost, the openness and the moves towards political pluralism, which we're witnessing even this year, but he also, I think, re-examined the position of the Soviet Union in the world, and that's what was most important to us. I think he realized that neither power could win the Cold War in any meaningful sense, that neither power could afford to go to nuclear war and without committing suicide, and that increasingly the Soviet Union could not afford to conduct the Cold War because the price was too prohibitive. He had to alter his priorities to concentrate on the domestic crisis. And in doing so, he was prepared for the first time, I believe, to make genuine concessions. And in his negotiations with Ronald Reagan, he surprised the Western powers and Washington by offering concessions that we had never expected from any Soviet leader. He gave up all intermediate-range missiles in the Treaty of 1987, which had been proposed many years earlier by President Reagan and had been rejected by the Soviet Union as being unfair. But I think the basic thing that Gorbachev did was to realize that peaceful coexistence, which had been a phrase and a tactic over the years used by Lenin and Stalin and Khrushchev and Brezhnev, could not simply be a tactic, a clever maneuver to buy time. It had to describe a new, longer-term relationship with the United States and the other Western powers, that it was no longer possible to think of a nuclear war, and therefore, in effect, the Soviet Union had to sue for peace and to ask for peace terms. Now, on the American side, this coincided with the presidency of Ronald Reagan. And at the outset, it seemed that Mr. Reagan was the least likely candidate to end the Cold War. You will remember his early speeches about the evil empire and many other speeches about the Soviet Union that made you believe that there was no opportunity or chance for him to negotiate with the Soviet Union. Indeed, it sounded as if he wanted to put them under pressure. And he was, in fact, putting them under pressure. We spent an additional $1 trillion in the Reagan years on our defense budget, and that certainly got the attention of the Soviet military as well as Gorbachev. But Reagan instinctively understood that there was a change in the Soviet Union and that Gorbachev was not simply the same as his predecessors. I think this is something that Mr. Reagan learned simply in his career. There was no great analysis there, not a cold-blooded decision, but instinctively he knew that something was happening in the Soviet Union and that he should encourage it. And one of the virtues of Mr. Reagan is that because he was a conservative, because his credentials were so strong as an anti-communist, he was able to make the kind of concessions that Gorbachev needed. And as you'll remember, the first summit took place in 1985, and they met 3 more times. And the last time when Gorbachev came to the United States and stood before the Statue of Liberty with President Reagan and George Bush, it seems to me that that moment symbolically was the end of the Cold War. Because if the Cold War had been about anything, it certainly had been about freedom. And for Gorbachev to be standing in front of the Statue of Liberty with the President of the United States was quite a symbolic change. There was one more act, and perhaps the most decisive act took place last year following the visit, and that was the revolution in Eastern Europe. I don't know of anyone who predicted it, and I think that goes for Mr. Gorbachev. It certainly goes for many of the leaders of Eastern Europe who are no longer with us. I agree. Why it happened, I think, is related to this reappraisal of foreign policy that I've been talking about under Gorbachev. In the summer of last year, Gorbachev, I think, recognized that the situation in Poland was getting out of hand, that the Communist Party was no longer able to govern, and that a change would have to be made, and that the change would probably have to be made in the direction of bringing in solidarity and the non-communists into some kind of coalition. And he agreed to this, and there was a telephone call made by the head of the Communist Party of Poland, Rakowski, to Gorbachev, and it was publicized as the reason we know this. And he said, what do? We Polish communists. And Gorbachev, in effect, said, join the coalition and that meant join the non-communist government. And I think that was a decisive turning point. That notion, that idea spread throughout Eastern Europe, that the Soviet Union would not intervene to save a communist government. And it spread to East Germany and Czechoslovakia and then everywhere. And by Christmas of last year, with the execution of Nicolae Ceausescu, in my view, the Cold War was finally and completely over. What does that leave us with? What are the current issues? The panel is going to address many of them, and I know you're waiting for Ambassador DUBININ and Ambassador Kennan, so let me simply mention what I think are two of the most important issues. One is the Baltic countries. The Baltic countries occupy a special place because the United States never recognized their incorporation. And we did so on the basis of a principle. The principle was not self-determination, as the press would like to have us believe. The principle is that we would not recognize the territorial gains through aggression, through military force. This is the Stimson Doctrine, named after Henry Stimson, who was a Secretary of State under Herbert Hoover, and when the Japanese went into China, we would not recognize their gains. We still do not recognize the incorporation of the Baltic countries, and I think it's very important that the Soviet leaders understand that this issue is not the same as some of the other territorial issues. We, as a government, I do not believe, seek the breakup of the Soviet Union. We do believe that the legitimacy of these countries to the legitimate desire to independence must be treated differently. President Bush, I think, has been admirable in his restraint and moderation, even though he's under great pressure from the right wing to be tough. What he's trying to do is to keep open the door to some kind of negotiated settlement, and I think it's important that he succeed. But it takes two to agree, and I think Gorbachev is going to have to understand that on the Baltic countries, the United States has a commitment that will be difficult if he goes into a bloodbath, emergencies, martial law, and so forth. We will have to react. I think he understands that, and I think that at the summit, this has got to be one of the major topics. It's a very sensitive topic because Gorbachev believes these are internal affairs. The United States has nothing to say about it. But that is not a reasonable position because on those three countries especially, we have to be for their independence. The second issue, and this is the real issue, more important than the Baltic, is the future of Germany. Germany will be united. There's no doubt of this. The questions are, what role will Germany play in Europe? It will be the strongest economic power by some degrees. It will be a major military power also, but probably non-nuclear, at least for now. The question is, what is the relationship between Germany and the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe? The Soviet Union is still holding out for a neutral Germany, but history has taught us that that is a dangerous position for Germany to be in. Germany, as a neutral, means it will play one against the other and swing back and forth, and that can only lead to very unstable politics in the heart of Europe. So the United States and its NATO allies have insisted that Germany remain as a united country in the NATO alliance. And we hope to persuade the Soviet Union to understand that its interests are served by that as well. Thus far, they have not agreed. So the German question remains open. And of course, it was the German question that helped to begin the Cold War, and it's only fitting that it should be one of the major issues at the close of the Cold War. To sum up, I think we have won the Cold War, and we've won for two reasons. We won, first of all, because we had the good sense to ally ourselves with the major countries of the world and to encourage our former enemies, Germany and Japan, to become working democracies, which they have become. And therefore, we do not stand alone, isolated, but we stand with all of the major industrial democratic countries. And that competition was too great for the Soviet Union, and especially it was too great for the Soviet system. So the second reason I believe we won the Cold War is that the Soviet system was fatally flawed. It could not continue the competition, but the most fatal flaw was the fact that in competing in the Cold War, in the Stalinist system, it had to suppress the freedom of other people inside its own country and in Eastern Europe. And as we have witnessed in Czechoslovakia, in East Germany, in Poland, freedom is simply too strong to be suppressed over any period of time. Let me end on a personal note. This has been a very dangerous period of our history. I've been involved on the periphery and sometimes at the center over these past 30 years. And I think our country owes a debt to the men who have conducted public policy in this period. Some of them have done so at personal sacrifice, and none of them have been more important, I think, to the general direction of this country than George Kennan. George Kennan has two qualities which I think have been very important for our country. The first is wisdom. He pointed the way in the early period after the war and during the war to the right course for the United States to oppose what I believe was the evil of Stalinism. But he also had another quality that is perhaps not as remarked on, and that is courage. Throughout this period, there have been some bitter debates about what the United States should do or not do. And at every major debate, at every major turning point, the voice of clarity and reason and wisdom has been that of George Kennan. And occasionally he's been by himself, but he's never been afraid to speak up. And it's that quality, I think, that we owe him the greatest personal debt, a man of great wisdom and great personal courage. Thank you very much.
Well, I think that applause attests to your appreciation and mine for that impressive, magnificent survey of the ups and downs of the U.S.-Soviet relationship provided by Mr. Hyland, and an insight based on experience and indeed his own wisdom. We have now come to the panel discussion of major issues in the U.S.-Soviet relationship with our three panelists, Congressman Jim Moody, Mila SASICH, and George REEDY. Each of their biographies, again, is in your program, so I won't repeat them in detail now, but will introduce each of them prior to their remarks. Jim Moody has served as congressman from the 5th Congressional District of Wisconsin since 1982 and has been a frequent participant in Institute programs. He has served as a congressional delegate to the U.S.-Soviet arms reduction talks in Geneva and Vienna since 1985, and has also been very active in following the progress of the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe and its various spin-offs. Congressman Moody will now reflect on some congressional perspectives of the U.S.-Soviet relationship. Jim.
Thank you, Carol. I, too, am honored to be here at the initial George Kennan lecture. I had the pleasure of spending an hour with Ambassador Kennan after I had returned from 2 years of working in Yugoslavia to brief him on my impressions of that country as he prepared to go there as ambassador. And we've had the honor of having him in Congress speak to us. And, of course, many of us remember his daughter, Grace Warnicki, Kennan Warnicki, who brought the Soviet American Youth Orchestra here to Milwaukee 2 years ago. I thought I would spend a few moments talking about congressional perspectives on our topic with a sort of implicit question, is there a role for Congress, plus or minus, in U.S.-Soviet relations? For 45 years, U.S.-Soviet relations have been dominated by security concerns. Bill Hyman has just given us an excellent review of those issues. In this context, the administration in the White House, be it Democratic or Republican, has clearly been the dominant shaper of U.S. opinion regarding the Soviet Union, the dominant definer of U.S.-Soviet relations. They define public opinion by interpreting the big international events like the Korean War, the Berlin blockade, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the China opening, and more recently the Central America conflicts, Nicaragua, El Salvador, etc. Realpolitik, or geopolitical concerns and considerations, are naturally the administration's strong suit and have dominated the discussions. I think it's fair to say that frequently the administration has projected East-West conflicts, and particularly the Soviet-U.S. conflict, onto those different areas of the world, and has often defined local conflicts, such as the conflict between Ethiopia and Somalia and the Horn of Africa, the whole South African issue regarding its neighbors, so-called wars of liberation, be they genuine or not, even the India-Pakistan conflict. They have tended to define those regional issues in East-West and, frankly, Soviet-U.S. terms. Sometimes that's been appropriate, and I think sometimes it may not have been. However, over the same period that this has been so, there has been a certain tension in our society, and therefore in Congress, between the realpolitik analysis that I've been alluding to, and we just heard an excellent summary of, and what I would call basic American values regarding human rights, democracy, self-determination, etc., and the peaceful approaches to problems as opposed to the military approaches to problems. The realpolitik meant that we backed clearly anti-democratic regimes in various parts of the world. Chiang Kai-shek in Formosa, Diem in Vietnam and his successors, the Shah in Iran, Marcos in the Philippines, Somoza, and before him Batista in Central America, Mobutu in Zaire, Haile Selassie in Ethiopia, etc. And as I said, even in South Africa, we have our policies towards that regime, which is hard to be otherwise hard to defend, have been strongly influenced by East-West and security considerations. Institutions in our own society, like the CIA, that engaged in some gross violations in human rights and in democratic activities, that engaged in assassination, disinformation, dirty tricks, overthrow of governments, and even subverting the National Students Association of the United States, those things were justified to Congress and to the American people on realpolitik grounds. But Congress has always had a significant discomfiture with the realpolitik approach to foreign policy. You can call it naive, you can call it idealistic, but I think there's been a strong strand in Congress that has been, and in the American public, that is continuously discomforted by that analysis. And therefore, over the years, Congress has sought to find chinks in the political wall of the East, dividing East and West, in the East-West conflict, to find chinks for the expression of human rights and other democratic values. Sometimes these efforts reinforced the realpolitik analysis, such as the Jackson-Vanik trade restrictions on the Soviet Union until and unless they improve their immigration policies, early economic and humanitarian aid to Greece and Turkey and even Yugoslavia in the 50s, and more recently in the mid-70s and 80s, the Helsinki Accords regarding human rights and other activities that tended to both support the basic human values that I speak of and also did reinforce the administration's point of view on security issues. But sometimes what Congress did went directly counter to the prevailing administrative points of view. It was basically Congress that defunded the Vietnam War. You remember at the time it was claimed that the war was not lost in Vietnam, but was lost in the halls of Congress as we scaled down the funding. So Congress and the American people simply couldn't stand the daily and nightly toll of human death and suffering that was brought into our living rooms. The Congress has attempted to put and has attempted to defy the administration of either Democratic or Republican persuasion by putting human rights conditions on aid programs, most notably in recent years in Central America. The Congress insisted on food aid to starving people in Ethiopia, which was initially resisted by the administration on the grounds that Ethiopia was an out-and-out Soviet ally. And of course, we're all familiar with the War Powers Act, where Congress tended to tighten the leash on the administration on the grounds that it was too ready to turn to military approaches. The Clark Amendment, which limited our ability in Angola, limited the administration's ability in Angola, congressional attempts to pass comprehensive test bans in the nuclear arena, and as you probably know, the House of Representatives on 3 successive Congresses passed a CTB, comprehensive test ban, which the administration considered an anathema. And of course, congressional interest in limiting chemical warfare. And Mr. Zablocki, one of the Milwaukee's finest congressmen, was a leader in that area. Again, counter to the realpolitik analysis coming from the administration. And by the way, it is this realpolitik strand of thinking inside Congress as well as elsewhere that tends to credit the recent dramatic changes in Eastern Europe to the proposition that the military pressure simply grew too great over the last 8 years, and that's what caused the what we now see as the dramatic changes in Eastern Europe and in the Soviet Union. On the other hand, there's a strong strand of feeling in Congress that, in fact, it was the inherent appeal of democracy and of human rights and of peaceful world order, which in fact led to the dramatic changes we are now seeing. So those debates continue, but Congress has continued to have a strong strand along those lines. Now, as we look ahead from here, I believe that Congress is well positioned for the reasons I've outlined, and for institutional reasons, because Congress always is best in peacetime and worse in wartime, and when war and military concerns are eclipsed, I think Congress can play a more constructive role. So for institutional reasons, as for value reasons, I think Congress is well positioned to play an active, constructive role in future U.S.-Soviet relations. As cooperation replaces conflict, Congress will have a lot to offer to enrich and enhance those relations. The Constitution gives Congress a number of explicit roles and semi-independent roles in foreign policy. And there is a full agenda in those arenas. I'll cite a couple. One is trade. Congress has always had a special interest in trade. And regarding trade and economic cooperation, this may and well be one of the keys to unlock future Soviet-U.S. trade relation improvements. We need to clear away the remaining barriers to Soviet-U.S. trade, the Jackson-Vanik Amendment and the Stevenson Amendment, assuming that the Soviet Union continues its new policies of letting people immigrate freely. And Congress also recognizes that, in fact, as international trade will be especially important to the Soviet Union as it attempts to both modernize and therefore improve its standard of living, which in turn we believe is a crucial element in promoting democracy, because democracy is hard to sell on an empty stomach, as well as opening up the Soviet Union to ideas, intellectual ideas, technology transfer, and belief ideas. And the other area where Congress clearly has a mandate because of its treaty responsibilities, particularly the Senate, but the House as well, because we have to pass enabling legislation in the House that carries out most treaties, is in the arms control area. Here there are a wide variety of topics. The short-range missile in Europe will probably be constrained by congressional action, if not otherwise. The carry-on agreements after START, we assume START will be more or less signed, but START is actually a rather modest agreement, and much more needs to be done in the strategic area than has been contained so far in the START talks. We need to, in my opinion, and this is a personal view, I think we need to lay to rest once and for all, and Congress has been the leader here, lay to rest once and for all the whole approach of Star Wars, which in my views which in my view is a highly destabilizing and provocative set of armaments. And I think also Congress will be pushing hard and working closely with the administration and with Soviet officials on the issue of nuclear non-proliferation, as we and the Soviets have tremendous mutual interest in limiting the number of new members to the nuclear weapons club. In the chemical warfare arena, similar sets of circumstances and opportunities arise. We need rigorous mandatory inspection standards, and I'm happy to report to you from my visits, my assignment to the chemical talks in Geneva, that in fact the Soviet representatives are the most cooperative of all the groups with our own ambassadors in looking for tough, no-nonsense inspection standards, inspection upon demand, and it is some of our allies, in fact, that are dragging their feet. So I think that's an area of tremendous cooperation and tremendous and growing importance, because chemical weapons will continue to be weapons of mass destruction available to relatively low technology societies. And finally, there is the area of conventional warfare, where for economic as well as other reasons, we in the Soviet Union have a tremendous mutual interest. So the end of the Cold War, if it is handled right, could, in my judgment, usher in a kind of golden age of positive, constructive congressional involvement in foreign policy. Freed by and large from realpolitik and military exigencies, Congress can act in close cooperation with the executive branch to enhance and strengthen relations with the Soviet Union and other Eastern Bloc nations in a wide variety of ways. There's a very rich agenda that has been basically postponed for 45 years, which awaits us, which awaits mankind. The spirit and philosophy of people like George Kennan will surely guide us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Congressman Moody. Thank you also for keeping your remarks within the 15 minutes allocated without my even mentioning it at the opening of the panel. We're sorry that we can't have questions and participation from the audience as we frequently do in programs of this kind, but because of the size of the audience, the number of participants as speakers, and the time available to us, we simply cannot do that. So we hope to get different points of view by having a panel of this kind. Mila SASICH, our second panelist, is manager of the International Economic Development in the City of Milwaukee's Department of City Development. He has had extensive hands-on experience in East-West trade and will address the economic impact of Soviet reforms on U.S.-Soviet trade and specifically on opportunities for the Milwaukee business community. Mr. SASICH.
First of all, I want to say that political and trade relations are directly connected. The improved political relations of the 70s were reflected in improved trade relations of that period. The most well-known Milwaukee area deal of this period was the sale by Allis-Chalmers Corporation of $87 million worth of equipment for an iron ore pelletizing plant in the Ukraine. Subcontracts were given out to Falk, Rexnord, and a number of other Milwaukee area companies. The invasion of Afghanistan in December 1979 is considered the formal end of this era of détente. Trade relations were affected. In January of 1980, President Carter declared a partial grain embargo against the Soviet Union, denying them the purchase of an additional 17 million tons. Canada, Argentina, and other grain exporting nations jumped in to take advantage of the situation. These lost grain sales are estimated to have cost the U.S. economy several billion dollars. The U.S. share of Soviet grain imports went from 69% in 1979 to 24% in 1980. On December 13th, 1981, the Polish regime declared martial law. Soon afterwards, President Reagan canceled U.S. government approval for Caterpillar Corporation to sell 100 pipe-laying tractors worth nearly $40 million to the Soviet Union. Caterpillar had hoped that this sale would be followed up with future purchases worth more than $500 million. The Japanese company Komatsu took advantage of the situation to expand its market share in the Soviet Union. Caterpillar's share of the Soviet market for imported track-type tractors was 85% in 1978. By 1982, Komatsu had taken over 85% of that market. Mikhail Gorbachev became leader of the Soviet Union in March 1985. In May 1985, after a 7-year gap, a cabinet-level trade meeting took place in Moscow between Commerce Secretary Baldrige and Foreign Trade Minister Patulichev. Both sides agreed to increase trade with one another. From then to the present, we have seen resumption of direct New York-Moscow flights, expanded grain sale agreement, joint ventures between U.S. and Soviet partners, $3 billion barter deal between Pepsi-Cola and the Soviet Union, a McDonald's restaurant in Moscow. This second era of improved political and trade relations with the Soviet Union has affected the Milwaukee area. A Milwaukee area company that produces food packaging equipment received a $32 million order in 1989. The Soviet order was subcontracted to 200 area companies. An area medical equipment manufacturer also made a sale to the Soviet Union. An area company filled an order for industrial valve automators to be used in Soviet pipelines. An area company is involved in a joint venture that organizes U.S. tours of Soviet musicians, choirs, and ballet seminars. Several other area companies are involved in talks with various Soviet organizations. On the import side, Milwaukee is home to Belarus Machinery, a Soviet-owned company responsible for the distribution of Soviet-built tractors. In 1989, this Milwaukee facility handled approximately 2,000 Soviet-built tractors. President Gorbachev's coming to power has led to improved political relations that have resulted in improved trade relations. U.S. exports to the Soviet Union in 1989 were $4.3 billion, a record, of which agricultural products made up $3.4 billion, or 79%. Machinery and equipment exports totaled $250 million, or about 6%. We imported $703 million worth of Soviet products, of which oil products made up 40%. Some of our other imports were tractors, palladium, anhydrous ammonia, plutonium, uranium, liquors, and ferrosilicon. In light of current U.S.-Soviet political and economic relations, U.S. exports for 1990 are expected to at least remain at this record level with room for expansion. President Gorbachev's economic priorities are heavily orientated towards expanding the supply of consumer goods to the Soviet people. This is reflected in U.S. business deals. 1989, large purchases of foreign consumer goods were made, toothpaste, soap, and detergent, from Colgate and Procter & Gamble, in order to deal with the shortages in the Soviet Union. Gillette is planning on building a large razor blade factory in Leningrad. Pepsi-Cola plans on expanding sales of soft drinks and the introduction of Pizza Hut restaurants. The largest recent Soviet order in the Milwaukee area was for the food industry. Because of plans to produce more cars, in March of this year, the parent of a Milwaukee company received a stateside $38 million order to supply a Soviet automobile plant with machine tools. This order is of significance because this $38 million figure represents total U.S. machine tool exports to the Soviet Union for the previous 8 years. President Gorbachev's democratization and decentralization of foreign economic relations has expanded business opportunities for U.S. companies. Previously, several dozen Soviet foreign trade organizations had a monopoly on import-export operations. As of April 1st, 1989, all Soviet enterprises, associations, and cooperatives have the legal right to deal directly with foreign companies. In the area of export-import operations, several thousand Soviet organizations have registered to take advantage of this new freedom. In the area of joint ventures, as of April 1st, 1990, more than 1,500 joint ventures with foreign partners have been registered. Of this total registered number, approximately 200 are operational. I'd like to give you some examples of how some U.S. and Soviet organizations have taken advantage of these reforms. Combustion Engineering, as an American-owned company, set up a joint venture in a plant 600 miles east of Moscow that assembles instruments and controls for the oil processing industry. A consortium of 5 companies, RJR Nabisco, Eastman Kodak, Chevron, Johnson & Johnson, and Archer Daniels Midland, are planning 25 joint ventures worth up to $10 billion that would produce oil, Ritz crackers, Winston cigarettes, Kodak blood analyzers and floppy disks, and processed wheat. As a final example, those Milwaukee area companies that are considering business deals with the Soviet Union are dealing with organizations that did not have this right before Gorbachev's reforms. Improved U.S.-Soviet relations have also caused the U.S. government to modify its position on a number of economic topics. Both the White House and the House Foreign Affairs Committee had developed proposals that would give the Soviet Union greater access to high-tech items, such as computers and numerically controlled machine tools with closer tolerances. Regarding agricultural exports, a recently signed 5-year grain agreement has increased the annual minimum shipment of U.S. grain to the Soviet Union from 9 million to 10 million tons. Further actions on the horizon are most favored nation treatment for the USSR, which would lower the tariffs on Soviet goods sold in this country. The resumption of export-import bank loans is another possibility. What implications do the factors mentioned above have for Milwaukee area companies? The Soviet Union has huge demand for a wide range of products, but is currently having difficulties in financing imports. Imports in priority areas are allocated foreign currency, but priorities are subject to change. From the previously mentioned examples, food packaging, medical equipment, valve controls, machine tools, and some consumer goods have been allocated the necessary financing. Other areas of opportunity are food processing equipment and industrial controls. I wish to conclude by saying that President Gorbachev's economic reforms have expanded the opportunities between Soviet and U.S. citizens to search for mutually beneficial business relations. Current Soviet economic problems pose difficulties for Milwaukee area companies to expand trade relations. However, as time goes on, Soviet economic reforms can be expected to produce a more efficient economy, one that will make the Soviet Union a stronger and more viable trading partner. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. SASICH, for giving us that practical view of some of the economic impacts of perestroika. Our third panelist is George REEDY, currently a professor of journalism at Marquette University and a prolific author on American politics. He served on the Senate staff of Lyndon Johnson and from 1963 to 1966 as President Johnson's press secretary. Professor REEDY will take a look at the role of the media in interpreting and explaining East-West relations to the American public. Professor REEDY.
You know, I've never quite learned how you handle that burst of applause that always follows the introduction of the speaker. What I'd like to do is grasp the podium and say, thank God, an audience that recognizes quality. Unfortunately, Carol has been jawing at me for the last 24 hours to keep it brief. If she has told me once to keep my remarks within bounds, it's been at least 10 times. A terrible thing to do to someone whose ancestral people were from County Clare, Ireland. But I really can't take a look at what the media is going to do at this point without going into something somewhat more basic, and that's what the public is going to do. What the media is going to do can be answered very simply. The media is going to reflect the opinions of our leaders and is going to reflect the opinions of the Soviet leaders. And one must realize that we are living in a period in which the American media have gone through a tremendous transition. For all practical purposes, the American media has abandoned the leadership role that it once played in the political life of this country. I can recall that when I was a child, there was no question whatsoever as to where the Chicago Tribune stood. It even went so far as to have form sheets which said Senator Thomas Walsh, Radical, Montana. Senator C. Wayland Brooks, American, Illinois. Guess who they were for? And I can remember the Chicago Times, who would not put a Republican's name in the paper unless he were caught in a hayloft with a sheep. Now that era is over. Today there are very few newspapers left in the United States that play that very aggressive role, which is something that is quite unusual for this country because our press from the very beginning has been a partisan press. It was founded at the time of our revolution by men who basically had no interest whatsoever in exchanging news. The only news you can find in the colonial press consists of ads for the sale of slaves, rum, and tobacco, the three things that seem to occupy the colonials more than anything else. News was handled by committees of correspondence. And over the years, even up into what we now call the modern press, which actually became the outbreak of the Civil War, even up to that point, and after that point, it remained a partisan press. When a newspaper said it was Republican, that meant it was Republican, money, marbles, and chalk. And when it said it was Democratic, that means that any Republican was anathema. Now, a number of things have happened to change that, and today, I think, to a great extent, the press, which has become somewhat sexless. I think today the press is going to reflect the American people, and what is important to us in terms of issues and where we go from here is not so much the question of the issues that we now think of. I think we're going to have some surprises. And to explain the surprises, I'm going to have to go back to one part of my life which is not very well known. And that is that I have been a mediator in a number of labor management disputes. And what I found in those disputes was something very interesting, which is that if the dispute had underlying it any type of ideology, that dispute could not be settled until the ideological differences were ruled out. And by ideology, I am not talking about the reflections of Immanuel Kant or the dialectic of Hegel or even Aristotle's Nicomachean ethics. I am talking about the basic soul of the people involved. I'll never forget the West Coast shipyard strike in which I was involved as a mediator. The problem with it was that the unions wanted to negotiate as individual unions. The shipyard owners wanted to negotiate with them all at once. And we were able to get nothing done until we had finally disposed of that issue. And then we found a number of surprises because the issues that we had talked about up to that point were really issues to talk about. You know, this is one of the strange things that one must get into when one lives in controversial politics, which is that quite often issues bear the same relationship to a dispute that a football bears to a football game. The football does not cause the football game, but you cannot play the game without the football. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if very many of the issues that we have been talking about for the last 15, 20, maybe 50 years have been footballs, with the basic issues much, much deeper. I get that feeling because when I look at many of them, it's very obvious that most of them could have been settled by an application of elementary common sense. You know, if we're both scaring the devil out of each other by tossing atomic bombs around, rattling them, that sort of thing, and we're both pretty scared. Okay, you get together and say, look, you need that many, I need that many to be safe. Why can't we get rid of all the rest of them? It was not that the issue was so complicated that gave us the problem. It's that there were underlying things that kept us from applying common sense. And I think that what we have done today is to reach the stage where we have cut away much of the underbrush. And I want to review that for a minute or two. There were two things that were involved, as I see it, in our relations with the Soviet Union. First of all, there was the presence of the Communist Party in the United States, which meant that as long as it was there, most Americans had the feeling, my God, that nation over there, what they are doing is financing a revolution in our country that would be in their favor and not in ours. And there was a period when the Communist Party in the United States became sufficiently large to be highly visible. This was in the 30s. The visibility was not due to any sudden desire to become Marxist. I think most Americans still think of Karl Marx as a jeweler in downtown Madison or something like that. But the sudden surge grew basically out of the Spanish Civil War. You have to be my age to remember it and to know that the Spanish Civil War had the same impact upon my generation that Vietnam had on my sons. It was, I can still remember weeping bitter tears the night Barcelona fell. And at that period, many young Americans, the leadership generation, mostly in the college campuses, started to flock to the Young Communist League because it was the only one that seemed to be doing anything. I didn't. I was actually out of a proletarian family. My folks were all either steel mill workers or lumberjacks. And when they started giving me this noble proletarian stuff, I knew better. But nevertheless, out of it grew a highly visible Communist Party, and I think that every time we tried to approach the Soviets or they tried to approach us, that what happened, everybody said, hey, wait a minute. You are trying to foment a revolution against our government. Now let's look at it from the other side of the picture, from the Soviet side. I don't pretend to be an expert on the Soviet Union or Eastern Europe, but I do have a working knowledge of history. And I know what happened at the time of the revolution. What happened at the time of the revolution is that the Soviet Union suddenly found itself hemmed in by the democratic nations, by England, by France, by the United States. Don't forget that. We had divisions up in Archangel which were there to support Kolchak and Rangel, the people from the Tsarist people that were trying to reestablish Tsarist control. And I think what happened is that fighting the Civil War in the Soviet Union, and again I'm having to guess here, but I can put myself in that place, finally left the Soviet people with a very deep suspicion that everything we were doing was merely an effort to reimpose some form of shrinkage upon the Soviet Union. And I think that those things held over years after the sensible reasons for it had disappeared. You know, you always have to take into account social lag. Some of you may be aware of the communist investigations that Congress staged in the 50s, late 40s rather, in the 50s. I covered most of them as a newspaper man. And you know, the interesting part of it was the Communist Party in the United States had been scattered to the four winds by then. What they were investigating was history. Well, the Communist Party had gone out for a number of reasons. It reached its high water mark with the Wallace campaign in 1948, which I also covered. And that was such a blatant attempt that afterward, almost everybody broke away from the Communist Party, and within a few years, I don't think it had any members left at all, except the FBI agents. It became, then on the other hand, I think it should have been perfectly clear to the Soviets that the old idea of encirclement was not really viable. What we were going to try to do, we were going to try to maintain defense perimeters. Essentially, but through things like the Marshall Plan, etc. But you know, things die slowly. And these basic underlying things did not go away immediately. Now, I think they have gone away. We have now a whole generation raised that did not have to go through the various communist scares of the 30s and the 40s. You have to be my age to at least remember a real, honest-to-God, live American communist. I still know a few, but they're there now. They're men and women who now bitterly regret that they ever got caught up in the communist movement. So what I think is going to happen to us is this. I think we're going to settle down to some negotiations, and I think in the course of those negotiations we're going to find that we're going to define a number of issues that are not now within our consideration. I think we're going to find that many of the things we have been talking about, they will be resolved rather easily. But there's one other thing that you must remember, and this is very important, and that is that in the United States, foreign policy is more subject to domestic pressure than in any other nation in the world. One of the biggest mistakes that I think many people have made, and I think including many of our foreign policy men who I have tremendous admiration, was their failure to realize that foreign policy is meaningless unless you have popular acquiescence. Now, I want to be careful about that word. I do not mean popular acquiescence in the sense that Ambassador Kennan understands an issue, or the people, his audience understands an issue, or I understand it, or Jim Moody. But nothing is going to happen in the United States unless some part of the American public is for it, some part of the American public is grudgingly willing to accept it, and some part of the American public is indifferent to it. And there is no majority or large minority that is opposed to it. You know, Franklin Delano Roosevelt found that out. He found it out a very bitter way in 1934 or 35, when he made his famous Quarantine the Aggressors speech, in which he tried to anticipate World War II by bringing together the various elements, England, France, and what have you, and he got turned down cold. The American people were not quite ready for it. Sometimes a president can precipitate action that has consequences that will override popular will, such as Vietnam. I don't think most Americans even knew where Vietnam was until the anti-war movement had risen so high that it could not be ignored. So consequently, when we go into the various things that are ahead of us, I think what we are going to find is that certain things cannot be negotiated. Certain things can be negotiated. I think we only have a very minimum view of what those things are. And the result of all this, I think, is going to be very good, but I think also there are many surprises. And now, I really want to astound Carol. You know, she was talking to me last night. She reminded me of Calvin Coolidge, who was famous for never saying more than 2 or 3 words. And at a reception one night, a young lady walked up to him and said, "Mr. President, I have just bet $10 I can get more than 2 words out of you." Coolidge said, "You lose," and walked away. Carol, you win.
Thank you, George, doubly. For all of you, I hope you'll give another round of applause to our entire panel, George Reedy, Mealy SASICH, and Congressman Moody. The Germanic part of my heritage is happy to announce that we are finishing not only on time, but ahead of time for the break. You'll have 15 minutes now to relax, stretch, use the facilities, but please return at 3 o'clock for the second portion of the program. Ladies and gentlemen, we're ready to resume with the second half of this first annual George F. Kennan Forum on International Affairs. And to introduce the Soviet Ambassador to the United States, Congressman Jim Moody.
Thank you, Carol. Ambassador DUBININ has certainly made his mark in Washington, D.C. It is said that he had some of the toughest shoes ever to fill in that town because he followed Ambassador DUBININ, who was Dean of the Diplomatic Corps, was widely respected in Washington, and served for many years with great distinction. But Ambassador DUBININ filled those shoes and filled them, and more than filled them. He spoke no English when he arrived in Washington, and meanwhile he has mastered our language with amazing speed. He has adjusted to the United States 1,000%. But his most lasting contribution will be that he helped shape a new face of the Soviet Union in the minds of the American public. This is because he served in the U.S. at a critical and pivotal point in U.S.-Soviet relations. He has represented his country during a period of glasnost and has helped to reshape and redefine the Soviet embassy and the Soviet message to reflect these new realities in his own country. His personal imprint has been great, and he is widely known in Washington for, and he and his wife are widely known in Washington for their charm and ease in with American ways. Within several days, Ambassador DUBININ is leaving us in the United States to his new post in Paris. We wish him the greatest of luck in his new assignment. In a recent goodbye party in Washington, the Soviet embassy, our Secretary of State, James Baker, said, Ambassador DUBININ reminded us with dignity and tact and with good humor that the basic original function of an ambassador remains intact. His contribution to U.S.-Soviet relations has been very important, and we will remember him for a long time with a great deal of warmth and affection. Ambassador DUBININ.
Thank you, Congressman. You are too generous. But you are absolutely right about my wife. Ambassador Kennan, Congressman Moody, Mayor NORQUIST, Chancellor Smith, Dr. Bauman, ladies and gentlemen. I am very pleased and honored to participate in this important forum which bears the name of George Kennan. Ambassador Kennan is well known and deeply respected in our country as a man who, at the dawn of the nuclear age, was one of the first to perceive and to warn against the deadliest threat of our time, that of nuclear confrontation. It is this realization that helped to set the foundations of the new political thinking and prepare the ground for the historic break with the Cold War, without winners or losers. It's very important if indeed we would like to build a new world based on cooperation and not on confrontation. Ambassador Kennan also gained recognition in the Soviet Union as a person who proved that it is possible to be a patriot of one's own country and a friend of another, while all the time preserving the independence of his political and moral judgment. Perhaps as no one of his predecessors, Ambassador Kennan felt a kinship for our country, its history, its culture, and its people. And maybe that is the reason why he always believed in its future. I think history is vindicating these beliefs. Ambassador, please accept my warmest greetings and best wishes. This event is all the more significant to me because, as you have heard, this is one of the last days of my mission to the United States. Bidding farewell to America, naturally, I am thinking about fascinating developments which have taken place in recent years in the Soviet Union and its relations with the United States. 4 years ago, when I came to America, the situation in our relationship was not a simple one. Nevertheless, I took up my job with a great sense of optimism and enthusiasm. What made me feel that way was confidence that the new Soviet policies of perestroika and glasnost would find a positive response with the American people. And indeed, one of the most gratifying impressions of my stay in this country was seeing the extent to which most Americans are interested in the destiny of perestroika and how much they want it to succeed. Actually, the cause of creating a new democratic society in the Soviet Union has ceased to be exclusively our domestic affair. It has become a part of global development. One can say that our perestroika has initiated a chain reaction of fundamental positive changes in the world, especially in Eastern Europe. True, the process of change in the Soviet Union now has entered a critical, perhaps a most difficult stage. The old system no longer works, but the new one is not yet in place. This in-between situation explains many difficulties we are facing. We are trying to make this transition period as short as possible. Therefore, the process of reform is being accelerated. Presently, it is months and sometimes weeks that bring about changes which otherwise would have taken years or even decades. In the economic area, the transition is underway from the rigid, centrally directed system to a regulated market economy. It is not an easy task in such a large and complex country as ours. At present time, the economic situation in the Soviet Union is complex and in some areas even deteriorating. On one hand, all this calls for further radicalizing and accelerating economic reforms, but on the other hand, we have to avoid serious instability in the economy and in material security of our people. But at any rate, in 2 days, at the beginning of the next week, our Supreme Soviet will discuss a big set of new measures destined to push forward the deep economic reform in the Soviet Union. Thus, the challenges perestroika is facing are enormous. The Soviet leadership is doing its best to keep the process of change within the democratic framework. For our leadership, there is no question of returning to the old methods and ways. Obviously, much is at stake in this process, both for our country and for the world. All of us feel that this is a turning point in world's affairs. Now that the Cold War is over, we have got a unique chance to build a new international order based not on the balance of fear, but that of interests. Perhaps for the first time in history, mankind's centuries-old dream about durable peace has got a chance. I think that all of us are increasingly aware of being a part of the whole civilization united by interdependence of countries and peoples, political and social systems. We are starting to effectively dismantle the structures of ideological, political, and military confrontation in order to address the problems which call for joint effort. These include not only elimination of nuclear, chemical, or conventional threat, but also protecting the environment, combating disease, fighting against terrorism and drug abuse, carrying out economic cooperation, and establishing broader human contacts. In Europe, there is a momentous task before the countries of the continent, jointly with the United States and Canada, to lay the foundations of a new model of security. That means to overcome the structures based on confrontation between alliances and the move towards common institutions of military and ecological security and economic and cultural cooperation. On the whole, as President Gorbachev put it, the world is entering a new promising stage of European and global integration. At this crucial juncture, it is very important not to make a mistake or miscalculation. Obviously, under these circumstances, the role of good, stable, and predictable Soviet-American relations could hardly be overestimated. When two powers, such as ours, are fully aware of each other's intentions, and when they cooperate in solving difficult issues, the world breathes easier and has more confidence in its future. Thus, the positive things we have achieved in recent years, and there are quite a few of them, belong not only to our countries, but a little bit to the entire world. Now we stand at the threshold of a major event in world politics. Only 2 weeks separate us from the meeting between President Gorbachev and President Bush. We expect the upcoming summit to bring substantial progress, especially in the area of disarmament. It should get us closer to the signing of agreements on radical reduction in strategic offensive arms. We also hope to expand and diversify our bilateral exchanges and cooperation. The potential here is really enormous. Take, for instance, economic area, and we have heard something very positive about it here. Perestroika in the Soviet Union has a direct bearing on our international trade and economic relations. One of our long-term goals is to integrate the Soviet Union in the global economic system. At Malta, President Gorbachev and President Bush agreed to a whole range of measures with a view to developing interaction in the economic area. Preparation of the trade agreement is the most important endeavor. We are also negotiating a number of other treaties which will broaden the legal basis for economic cooperation, including the agreements on investment guarantees, taxation, civil aviation, maritime transport, etc. In the process of reforming our economy, we seek to take advantage of international experience whenever it could be applied on our soil. Soviet experts have been visiting the United States to discuss small business, security market, monetary system, etc. American experts traveled to the Soviet Union. We expect that the Washington summit will create a better political and legal environment truly conducive to completing normalization of our trade and economic cooperation. Ladies and gentlemen, before concluding my remarks, let me stress that conceptually the ground work is done to move towards a next stage of Soviet-American interaction. The major element is President Gorbachev's statement at Malta to the effect that we no longer view the United States as our adversary. And President Bush Bush's statement on the new closeness between our two countries. The last few years were the beginning of a new era in Soviet-American relations. Let us ensure that no considerations of expediency prevent us from moving further towards peaceful world based on common human values, international law, and cooperation. Thank you very much. It was a big honor for me.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Dubinin. We're very pleased that you came to Milwaukee to be with us at this forum, and we appreciate very much your taking the time out of what I know is a very hectic schedule right now before your departure. We wish you very well in your new assignment. And now, to introduce Ambassador Kennan, the Mayor of the City of Milwaukee, John O. NORQUIST.
Thank you, Professor Bauman, Ambassador Dubinin, and Ambassador Kennan. Last summer, I think it was, David Schwartz, who owns the Schwartz bookstore, told me that I should read a book about somebody who was born and raised in Milwaukee named George Kennan. And I have to confess that I didn't know that George Kennan had been born and raised in Milwaukee, attended Milwaukee Normal School and lived on Cambridge and worked and played in this city and grown up to become the great ambassador and historian that he is today. I knew about him being an ambassador and historian, but I did not know he had grown up in Milwaukee. And so I bought the book. David refused to give it to me, and I bought it. And I read the book, and it was not only about some places in Europe that I had been, such as Berlin and Scandinavia and so forth, but also about Wisconsin and Milwaukee, and a beautiful chapter which begins on page 36 if you want to buy the book. It's available not only at Schwartz but all the other bookstores in Milwaukee. There's a beautiful chapter that begins on page 36 about a bicycle ride that George Kennan took across Wisconsin in 1938. And it's so beautiful and so moving. It describes Wisconsin about as well as anyone ever could. I was so impressed with the book
which I read all the way through, which I don't do with a lot of books that I get. I was so impressed with it that I bought almost as many copies and gave them away as gifts as I've bought of my sister Loie Nelson's tape. In fact, at one point there was a shortage. They ran out of books at Schwartz Bookstore because of me, I'm proud to say. The description of George Kennan's career is one that I think the newspapers and the media have done enough about, but I just want to say that this morning he and I rode around the city a little bit, and we saw Milwaukee Normal School, which is now Mitchell Hall at UWM, and we were on the street where he grew up, Cambridge Street. Unfortunately, the house that he lived in is torn down, but many of the houses that were in that neighborhood at his time of living there are still there. And I was very impressed with his knowledge and his interest in cities. Ambassador Kennan has the respect and attention of those who look for a better life in their communities wherever they live on this earth. And certainly he should have the attention and respect of Milwaukeeans. The historians who succeed Ambassador Kennan will note his place in American history as being a key State Department official between 1926 and 1953. They'll also talk about his many books, most recently, of course, Sketches from a Life, which I referred to earlier. Ambassador Kennan loves cities, and he recognizes the value of cities as market centers and centers of culture. He has expressed in his most recent book his dismay at the decentralization of our country caused by the automobile and the overemphasis on highway construction in America. He has been a great advocate of public transit and rail transport, which he says, quote, brings people together and allows them to communicate. The auto, he says, has contributed to the decline of certain forms of social discipline. Ambassador Kennan has remarked on the speed these days in America with which the joyous, adventurous years of childhood vanish. And he has noted the American penchant for living life vicariously through the television set, with minds tuned inward to a script-perfect, homogeneous mass culture. He reminds us that individuals' study, hard work, thought, and writing are to be valued. We are to use our minds to enhance the well-beings of our families, of our neighbors, our communities, and the world that we live in. Ambassador Kennan gives us a challenge to Americans that may be as important as his comments on foreign affairs after World War II, a challenge to pursue in our daily public and private lives, to strive toward our innermost high thoughts and purpose, and to seek peace in this world. Here in Milwaukee, we are working to build a community of understanding and purposeful life. We are striving to learn and care about each other. Ambassador Kennan, from meeting you and talking with you, I know you love your hometown, Milwaukee, and I want you to know that Milwaukee loves you. Ambassador Kennan, Ambassador Kennan, welcome home. And ladies and gentlemen, Ambassador George F. Kennan.
First, I think I ought to mention a personal note here. It's very moving, as you can imagine, to hear all these things, nice things said about you, and especially in your own hometown. At the same time, it's disturbing because you look back over your life and you are aware, particularly at that moment, of the many things that you did that were wrong, of the many judgments you made that were unsound, of the many things you should have thought of, should have said that you didn't. And all that involves a rather painful effort to put yourself into perspective, as the members of your family are much better able to do. I seem to recall being told once about an Irish funeral at which the widow of the corpse, while the eulogies were going on, was seen occasionally to lean over and lift up the top of the casket and look inside. And on being asked afterward why she did this, she said, well, I just wanted to be sure I'd come to the right funeral, and this was... whether this was really my Jim. Well, Milwaukee has a right to ask, too, whether this is really her George. It is a very moving experience to come back here in this way. I'm very well aware that the first 15 years of anybody's life are the most impressionable ones, and that what happens to him in those years leaves a stamp on him which is enduring, which he can never be separated from. Well, that was what Milwaukee did to me, for better or for worse, in the first years of this century. And everything that I see now in this city brings back memories. Even this theater, I must have been here several times in my life, not very often, but the only time I can remember is when there was a sort of a city performance of some old German play, Rumpelstiltskin, I think it was, and there were hundreds of school children who took part in it, and I appeared on this stage as an elf. So please, when we talk together today, put me back in that position, and we'll understand each other better. I would like to comment on each of the what was said by each of the speakers earlier this evening. I can't really do it, the time does not allow it. I was very impressed, I must say, with the resume of Soviet-American relations that was given by my good and respected friend here, Bill Hyland, at the beginning of this afternoon. And also I must say that what Ambassador Dubinin has just said to you is something that means a great deal to me, because I've been involved in Soviet-American relations longer, I think, than anyone now in the running in this country. And I've lived through many years when things that were said in one country about the other were not always pleasant to listen to. It was a wonderful, for me, experience, and in a way a wonderful ending of this kind of a career, to hear such words from a representative of a country that I've come to know very greatly, the representative of a people from whom I have the greatest respect, and about a relationship which has meant so much to me. Now, there's not a great deal I can add to all of this. I will, however, just say a few words about where we stand today. I don't think there's ever been a moment of greater uncertainty in the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union than the one we are now going through. In the first years of Soviet power, from the revolution down to World War II, the chief factor in this relationship was the ideological and political conflict between the two countries, the two ideologies that controlled them. After the war, this factor was largely overtaken by the military political competition, which so dominated the relationship over 3 or 4 decades. Now, the changes that have taken place in recent years under Gorbachev's rule have made both of these earlier factors, the ideological one and the military one, relatively unsubstantial. They no longer have their reality, the reality that permitted them at one time to overshadow the entire relationship as they did for so long. And that means that we are forced as Americans to look for new guidelines in our approach to our relations with that country. One is tempted to say that we are back where we were in 1917, confronted again with the old Russia that we had known before that time. And in some ways that would be correct, but in other ways it would not be, because the 70 years of communist power that have intervened have changed Russia very greatly, as these years have us here, and not always for the good. It is true that the Communist Party today is in a great process of change, perhaps of disintegration, and can probably never be restored. In particular, I'm glad to say that there is no possibility that I can see ever of returning to that dreadfully distorted version of what was known as communism, which prevailed in the time of Stalin. But a return to that old Russia of the centuries before the revolution would also now, for many reasons, be impossible. The fact is that the country we think of as the Soviet Union, the successor to the old Russian Empire, with its central core of Russian people and its surrounding belt of non-Russian peoples, this historic entity is in a state of change and instability and uncertainty, a time of turmoil and confusion, more extreme than anything it has experienced since the revolutionary year of 1917, and perhaps greater than any crisis Russia has ever faced since the so-called time of troubles, a great crisis of the monarchy and of the Russian state that occurred at the beginning of the 17th century. Let me just point out what I see as the 3 major ingredients of this situation of instability and uncertainty, just to point out how serious they all are. First, there is the state of the Russian economy. This had begun to decline even before Gorbachev came in. He thought he had diagnosed the main reasons for this decline, and his perestroika was a program of reform intended to correct the deficiencies and to halt that process of decline. Unfortunately, for reasons too numerous and complicated to be discussed here, it has not had this effect to date. It has in some respects only heightened the difficulties, and particularly when it comes to the supply of consumer goods for people in the great cities. Gorbachev has tried to introduce gradually the principle of free enterprise as a means of increasing and improving distribution and production of these consumer goods. The idea, I am sure, was quite sound. With time, I think it may yet begin to show its positive effects, but not up to now. And what we see before us today is a country where the old communist system for operating the economy has been extensively disrupted, whereas the new system, as was pointed out here earlier this evening, has not yet entirely taken hold. The result is that the country is falling uncomfortably, you might say, between 2 chairs. And this has been not an easy burden for Gorbachev to bear politically. It has greatly strained the confidence that he has won and enjoyed for so many years in that country. Secondly, finding that the Communist Party was not in all respects a useful instrument to help him with his reforms. In fact, in some cases, it has, I think, complicated the achievement of them. He has been trying, and with some success, to shift the center of gravity of political power from the Communist Party apparatus, where it had rested for some 70 years, to a properly elected governmental apparatus where the Communist Party would no longer have a monopoly of power, but would be, as political parties normally are in other countries, only one of the contenders for popular support. Now, this is an historic and fundamental change in Russia's political life, measured not only against these last 7 decades of communist power, but against all the earlier centuries of Russian history. And it was a change that was greatly needed and greatly to be welcomed. But at the present moment, this change, too, is only halfway completed. The new and largely democratically elected parliament seems to have taken over much of the power in the great cities, but in large sections of the countryside, the local party committees still seem to be in control and to be operating relatively independently. And the result is that there is, at the present moment, no clear and universally recognized center of political authority. No one knows where to turn very often to get an answer. And in a country where people are used to knowing where the seat of power is, knowing to whom you can appeal and from whom you can get an answer, this is very unsettling and in some respects, I think, dangerous. Finally, one of the things that Gorbachev did succeed in doing was to abolish the old system of censorship and police terror, to concede in most essential respects freedom of speech, of thought, of the press, of political demonstration and action. Now, this was fine, and again, a great step forward, but it proved to be a contagious development. It had the effect of spreading not only to the countries of Eastern Europe, where, as we all know, it led to the overthrow of communist regimes right down the line, but also to certain of the non-communist nationalities within the Soviet Union as well. And here, as one sees in the case of Lithuania, the result has been a sudden and impulsive demand for immediate, complete secession for the Soviet Union. And Lithuania, as you know, is not the only place where this effect has been felt. Other nationalities, too, aspire to independence. They are watching which way the Lithuanian conflict is going to come out, to see which way they, too, should jump. And one has to bear this in mind when one thinks today about the problems of Lithuania and of our relationship to that conflict. Now, the Soviet Union is the last of the great multinational and multilingual empires to feel the disintegrating effects of modern nationalism. The others, examples would be the old Turkish Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, had already long since gone by the boards. Modern nationalism, which is the most powerful political emotional force of our age, has proved simply incompatible with the holding together of a great variety of national groups under a single imperial center. And the Soviet Union, too, is vulnerable to these centrifugal tendencies. In the end, I am sure, it will have to make way for them, at least to a considerable extent. And several of its components, particularly the Baltic countries, will have to receive sooner or later, in some form, their sovereign independence. But But this is not a simple problem. It is not a problem that can be solved, properly solved, from one day to the next, just by this or that nationality's declaring itself to be independent. For one thing, not all the non-Russian nationalities in the Soviet Union want complete independence or are in any way prepared for it. Their situations vary. But beyond that, even in the case of the Baltic countries, there are many things to be talked out in every instance if the process is to go forward peacefully and successfully. An abrupt, disorderly disintegration of the Soviet Union could be dangerous for the stability of the whole European continent, could be dangerous for us, and could be dangerous even for some of these restless Soviet minorities themselves. Now, all these forms of change, the attempted economic revolution, the shift of the political center from party to government, and the partial dissolution of the empire, these things are all coming together and interacting, and altogether they create a situation, the future of which is, for people here anyway, absolutely unpredictable. Anything might happen. A partial breakup of the Soviet Union, a breakdown of government in various parts of the country, a split of the Communist Party, civil war, temporary regimes here and there, conditions such as those that prevailed 70 years ago at the time of the Russian Civil War. I am not predicting that any of these things will come. They don't have to come, but none of them can be excluded. And nobody can tell you exactly what will come. And the result of all this is that our government does not know and cannot know at this point with what sort of a Russia it is going to have to be dealing in the months and years to come. The uncertainty of the situation in Russia inflicts an equal uncertainty on American policy toward that country. Mr. Gorbachev may, of course, remain in office for a long time. It is not impossible that he will succeed in mastering all his present difficulties and creating a much more stable situation. If so, so much the better. He is a great man. His efforts lead in the right direction. He deserves our good wishes. But whether or not that will happen is, again, something we cannot know. And I think it will be a fairly long time, even in the best of circumstances, before we can see what the outcome of all these present difficulties of this great period of crisis will be. Well, what does that mean for American policy toward Russia at this time? It seems obvious to me, as has been often pointed out, that our policy should be, of course, a cautious one that avoids involving this country or taking sides in the many tensions and conflicts that have begun to mark and must continue for some time to mark the state of high instability in Russia that I've just described. We should, of course, maintain our detachment. We should use what little influence we have to see that developments there proceed peacefully and in a constructive way. But we should do so, I think, as a helpful, distant friend, not as an involved party. That, so far as I can see, is what President Bush is doing, and I can only commend him for it. He is right, I think. He is right, I think, for this and for other reasons, to refrain from involving this country directly in the difficulties that have arisen over Lithuania. It would be this independence demand on the part of the Lithuanians, we must remember, is not the last of this sort that are going to be raised. Others are going to raise the same demand, and what we do in this case is going to serve as a precedent. And it would be a very unwise procedure to commit the policies of this country to a general breakup of the Soviet Union and to offer our support by implication to any group that wants to separate itself from that political entity. Any policy of that sort might land us in the end in some very strange and uncomfortable company. We have troubles enough of ourselves these days, it seems to me, without multiplying them by that sort of involvement. Mr. Bush is also quite right, in my view, to go ahead with the forthcoming summit meeting as he is doing, and there is no reason at all why the present efforts at arms control and reduction should not continue to be pursued at all levels, vigorously, boldly, and with goodwill. I hope we will do it. But back of all this, and through it all, we will be well advised to try to bear in mind at all times the long-term aspects of this relationship. It is just about 2 centuries since the official relationship between Russia and America came into existence. For most of those 2 centuries, especially up to the Russian Revolution of 1917, the two peoples lived together very amicably and related to each other that way, even though their systems of government were very different. They were never at war with each other and have never been at war with each other. And in their respective national temperaments, the two peoples have a great deal in common. I think anyone who has ever lived in Russia will join me in that judgment. So there is here a great deal to build on. It is, of course, true that so long as Russia has this nationalities problem, and so long as Moscow appears to be holding in subservience against their will other people who want their independence and seem to be ripe for it, this is going to constitute, as it has constituted in the past, and not only in the communist period, but also at the beginning of this century in the final years of Tsardom, it's going to constitute and bound to constitute a disturbing factor in the relationship. And for this reason, the sooner Russia manages to come to terms with this problem, the better it is going to be for Russian-American relations. And we have every reason to hope that things will now move successfully and progressively in that direction. But to hope for a certain thing, to hope that a certain thing will happen in another region of the world, far from our shores, is one thing. To try actively to bring that about is another. This, essentially, the problem of the Russian nationalities in Russia, of their relationship to the center, this is Russia's problem, not ours. It is in some respects a complicated problem. No country ever understands perfectly another country's affairs, and none is likely to do much good by interfering in them. Let us wish them well as they get on with this problem. Let us be helpful where we can, but let us not make ourselves a part of the problem. Now, the outstanding question of military security in Europe, of NATO, of German unification, and of the future of the various alliances and armed forces that have been stationed in that continent and continue to be stationed there, that is something else again. Here, in contrast to the other matters I've just been discussing, here our involvement and our responsibility are obvious. And here, I am not so sure that we are yet on the right track. we seem to be rapidly locking ourselves into an insistence that NATO should continue to exist and that a united Germany should be not only a member of it, but should continue to figure as one of the continent's two greatest military powers, the other being France. That this does justice to the military anxieties of our French and British friends who don't want to be left alone with Germany in a new Europe is obvious. But that it does equal justice to the security concerns of the Soviet Union is not so apparent. It is Gorbachev, I believe, who once said that you have to remember, if peace is to be preserved, you have to remember that the other fellow's security is just as important to you as is your own. And we would do well to bear this in mind as we face these new problems that are arising of the security arrangements on the European continent. I have read somewhere in the past 2 or 3 times, I've read of statements being made in the NATO circles to the effect that we don't need to be too concerned about Soviet feelings in all these matters of Germany's military future, because people in Moscow are today preoccupied with their own troubles, and even if they don't like the arrangements we propose, there is very little they could do about them. Well, I would like to take this occasion to say that it never pays, in my opinion, for one great country to take advantage of the momentary weakness or distraction of another great power in order to force upon it concessions it would not have accepted in normal circumstances. This procedure may be seen to have its advantages in the short term. Over the long run, in my own experience and observation, it always revenges itself. The Russians are justly proud of their great war effort in the Second World War, and they will expect to see due recognition given to that in the dispositions that are under discussion today. To some extent, I'm happy to say this does seem to be recognized in Washington, and I have the impression that we are trying to move our British and French friends to join us with the Russians in meeting the Russians. That is not halfway, but at least a portion of the way, about 20% of the way. I doubt that this is enough, and I hope that we will give this matter very careful thought before we go further. For this is a highly sensitive issue, and it can cause us a lot of trouble if we arrive at the wrong conclusions today. Well, ladies and gentlemen, fellow Milwaukeeans, that is all I have to add to the excellent discussions that took place here earlier this afternoon. Let me congratulate the Institute of World Affairs on the arrangements that have made this occasion possible. Let me wish it well with its further efforts to promote the understanding of international affairs in the Milwaukee community, and let me wish all the rest of you well with all that concerns you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Kennan. The applause you have just heard expresses our admiration, our appreciation, and our very, very warm affection. I'm sure that many in this audience, like myself, have read many of your writings and have valued your many contributions to the foreign policy of our country. But to see you, to meet you, and to hear you and your analysis has been an experience that, for me at least, is not to be replicated. On behalf of all the sponsors, the City of Milwaukee, the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and the Pabst Theater, I would now like to bring this first annual George F. Kennan Forum on International Affairs to a close. Thank you all for attending.